Hello everyone, welcome back to the Analyst for 29th March 2025, where we will be discussing 7 most important articles for UPSC CSE from the Hindu and the Indian Express. In the first section of our analysis, we are going to talk about the recent Myanmar earthquake in details in a very comprehensive manner, covering all the aspects of the natural phenomena of the earthquake and also the various mitigation strategies that we need to take over a period of time. In the next article, we are going to discuss about a very interesting editorial on India's geopolitical vision, where we have to talk about the recent imperatives in our international relations arena. In the next part of our discussion, in the simplified section, we are going to take up 5 more important articles which are extremely crucial for the upcoming prelims 2025 examination. So stay tuned. Hi guys, welcome back to the Analyst. So I hope you all are doing well. Your preparation, I hope, is also going fine. With this, we'll be starting with the very first article today, wherein we have this extremely severe earthquake which has shaken Myanmar, which has claimed the lives of more than 1,000 people, which is even counting as of now, as I'm speaking. And also there are lots of thousands of casualties, the people who are injured, and also many are feared trapped. So this is why we need to discuss about this geophysical phenomena of earthquakes in great detail. We'll be starting from extremely basics to also try to understand how India is also vulnerable towards many earthquakes, what are our mitigation strategies, what are the challenges, and what we should be doing along with the government initiatives. So let us start, because it is highly important for the prelims, where we have to talk about Indian and world geography, due to which we have many questions also that we have to practice for our earthquake topic. In our GS1, we have the direct topic, which is earthquake, mentioned in the syllabus as a part of an important geophysical phenomena such as earthquakes, tsunami, volcanic activities, cyclones, and etc. Along with this, we also need to study disaster management. Along with, we also need to look into the various strategies we need to adopt for earthquake damage mitigation. Now, when I start this topic, we have to basically understand from the extreme basic levels how earthquakes occur in the very first place. To understand this, look very prominently at this diagram. So in this diagram, I will be trying to explain you alongside the various important key terms. Now, at the very beginning, the place where the earthquake waves originate, this is actually the place which is known as the focus or the hypocenter, just above the particular point from the interior of the earth, or say the point from the focus towards the exterior of the earth on the surface. We call this as the epicenter. And obviously we know that the earth is actually composed of extremely numerous amounts of major plates, minor plates, which are known as the tectonic plates. We know that these tectonic plates are in constant motion against each other, away from each other, due to which they generate a huge amount of force and energy which is released in the form of earthquakes when we talk about it, when we see it in our day-to-day lives. So that is where we firstly have to attribute the cause of earthquakes around 3 important causes. Firstly, due to plate tectonics, where it leads to various fault zones in the earth. Secondly, due to various volcanic activities. Thirdly, due to various human-induced earthquakes. Now, when I talk about the very first one, look at this one. Look at the various types of faults. Look at the normal fault here, where we generally have these faults or this inclined kind of a structure between our Earth's blocks. That is where we find that these faults are generally the cause of intense amount of temperatures within our earth, which changes the volume and the density of our rocks, which makes them extremely weak at the bottom, and also sometimes cracks develop alongside the same, due to which we generally refer these kinds of faults as normal faults when a particular section of our landmass try to get subsided in a downward direction. When the same occurs opposite, for example, the same section can actually slide upwards. That in that case we know this as a reverse fault. And also there are various instances where there can be transform faults or strike slip faults, which actually move in an horizontal manner away from each other in this direction. So generally we have earthquakes originating in all of these 3 kinds of faults, and the energy that is released due to this movement of the faults, they are extreme, and also the energy can be classified into two ways, various, via the various waves that this energy generates. Generally, there are two ways in which the waves propagate. That is, firstly, we have something which we know as the body waves. Secondly, we have something which we know as the surface waves. Now, whenever any earthquake is occurring, we have the body waves which are generated for the first time, and also within the same we have two classifications, the primary waves and the secondary waves. From the very name we can understand that the primary waves are originating for the very first time. They are much more faster than the secondary waves, and also they can transmitted across solids, liquids, and even gases. But when we talk about the secondary waves, they are much more slower than the primary waves, and they cannot transmit, or say they cannot actually be transmitted via the liquid. And also we have to understand the primary waves are generally in the manner of compressional waves, which are generally the nature of the transmission of sound energy which we see across our space, right? Also, the S waves are in an S shaped when we talk about how these waves propagate in the interior of our Earth. So it actually transmits in an S shaped manner on a, in this way, when it is actually leading to the tear and the various destruction of rocks on the surface too. Apart from this, we have the surface waves, which are actually in the form of love waves and the Rayleigh waves. As we can see here, these are the love waves which are actually transmitted in a snake-wide manner, right, in a snake-wide shape along our surface. Also, when we talk about the Rayleigh waves, these are often in the form of a rolling kind of waves on the surface of our Earth. So based on this, we have generally the body and the surface waves in which the energy propagates. Generally, we have to kind of consider that these surface waves are actually very destructive, because this takes place along the surface of our Earth, where we have the buildings, where we have the urban settlements and the various other human infrastructure, which actually is attributed to the loss and damage of our infrastructure there. Now, we need to understand how the volcanic activities also influences earthquake. Generally, we know that the movement of magma within the volcanic chambers and also the subsequent eruption of the volcano sends seismic waves throughout the surface and even the body, or say the interior of the Earth. Next, also when we talk about the human-induced earthquakes, we have to take an example. Now, all of you may have heard of a 1967 earthquake in Koyanagar, which actually took place due to the construction of an artificial lake. Now, we understand that for our irrigation purpose, so for our agriculture purposes, we actually try to construct various artificial water bodies. Now, that is all fine, but the long-term consequences of such artificial lakes are extremely alarming, because generally when we construct the artificial lake, the weight of the water is actually on the ground, and this can create a long-term pattern of seismic, say, vulnerabilities within our Earth. Next, also the water from the lake can seep downwards the crust, and they can actually try to loosen the rocks, due to which even faults like normal rivers or strikes the faults can develop. And let me tell you, this Koyanagar earthquake was at the magnitude of 6.7, which was extremely destructive at that point. After this, now we need to talk about how these earthquakes are also classified on the depth of the focus, correct? Now here, we need to consider that the earthquakes actually originate from, say, being a very shallow earthquake to intermediate to a deep focused earthquake, where these kind of depths are given here. So based on this, we have the classification on the types of on actually the depth of the focus of any particular earthquake. And the recent earthquake which took place in Myanmar is actually classified as a shallow focus earthquake, which is considered as one of the most destructive earthquakes ever, because these earthquakes are actually taking place near the surface of our Earth, as you also can see from this particular diagram. So whenever we try to understand these earthquakes based on the focus, firstly, we have the shallow focus, where these are also known by the name of crustal earthquakes, where it is said that out of all the earthquakes, of all the energies which are generated during earthquakes, 70 to 85% of the energies are actually released by the shallow focus earthquakes. Next, it is followed by the intermediate focus earthquakes in the range of 12 to 15%. And finally, in the matter of, say, 3 to 5% in the case of deep focus earthquakes. So this is where we have to understand that these kinds of shallow focus earthquakes, which are kind of nearer to the surface of the earth, these cause much more extensive damage than the other kinds of earthquakes. It can be the case that a deep focus earthquake is having much more force, greater energy, but over, say, the depth of, say, the focus from the surface, this energy kind of dissipates. This energy kind of reduces over a period of time. But the shallow focus earthquakes are actually the most destructive one. Now, we need to focus on the India's vulnerabilities towards earthquakes. According to a Bureau of Indian Standards map and exercise which has been done by them, they have created a seismic zone map of India, that was done in 2002. It has been found out that in India, 59%, around 59% of the land area is liable to seismic hazard damage. That is, it is actually prone to earthquakes. Based on this, we have tried to divide into zone 1, 2, 3, 4 based on the risk levels. From zone 1 to zone 5, as you go upwards, the risk level of the earthquakes, they typically increase. If we look at the map more closely, we find that the Northeast India, right, we have some sections of Jammu and Kashmir, the state of Uttarakhand, even Gujarat, which are actually falling under the zone 5 of the intensity levels. That means these areas are extremely prone to earthquakes. Now, when I talk about the various areas of our country and also the types of earthquakes which are, or say the vulnerability or say the frequency of earthquakes which have taken place in the past, we have to start with the Indian Himalayas. Now, we know that the Indian plate is actually also constantly striking against the Eurasian plate. And that is why we find most of the, say, intensive kind of earthquakes take place in the Himalayas themselves. Out of, say, the entire Himalayan ranges, generally the central Himalayan mountains have lesser earthquakes, but it can be a possibility that in the future, going forwards, there can be much more earthquakes because that is an area which is always going constant amount of changes due to plate tectonics. Also, if I try to categorize the various previous earthquakes based on, say, the Shillong earthquake, Assam and the Bihar earthquake which has taken place over a period of time, we can say that all of them are in the excess of 8+ magnitude. Next, when I come to the, alluvial plains or the, Indo-Gangetic plains, we generally presume that the Indian plains are kind of safer, but it is not the case. Actually, we have to understand that the rocks below the Indian plains are actually the same rocks that compose the Himalayan ranges, which are kind of always undergoing these, changes between them, beneath our Earth's surface, beneath the interior. That is always we have to keep in mind. The Indian plate and the Eurasian plate are always in constant motion. Next, when I talk about the, say, central highlands and the plateau region, these areas are also prone to earthquakes. When we have to understand there are numerous of intraplate faults. There are also various internal deformation of the Indian plate due to the striking of the same with the Eurasian plate, due to which the balance between the plates have kind of been shaken. And also when I talk about the various sites of earthquake potential areas, so these are the Kutch region, the Narmada Sun basin, and also the Godavari rifts and the Delhi Aravalli fold belt. So these are the areas where we find high potential of future earthquakes too. And also we have to keep in mind that knowing the vulnerability of any country is very important for actually accessing the impacts and also the mitigation strategies. Firstly, we need to easily understand what are the various impacts here, because there can be questions in mains which can ask you basically about the impacts of an earthquake. Firstly, we know that the structural damage that arise out of an earthquake and also the various aftershocks due to earthquakes, they are quite prominent in also bringing down entire skyscrapers down, as we have seen in the recent 7.7 magnitude earthquake in the Myanmar. So that is all you can understand. This here was actually a skyscraper which was brought down. Next, this creates surface rupture and ground displacement, generally due to various kinds of faults, right? You can see various images where particular roads, right, they have been totally separated from each other due to the movements of the faults. Next, impacts can also lead to tsunamis, because tsunamis are generally caused by underwater extremely strong earthquakes. So these are also extremely, say, impactful for the coastal communities. Another way in which the coastal communities are affected is due to the liquefaction of soil. Firstly, understand the various layers of soil and the crust below the coastal landforms. Generally, we have the topsoil on the top, and we have the sand, and finally we have the sand below the water table. So if you can understand, this is generally the water table. Due to any earthquake related events, right, we have the shaking of the ground, the various faults which actually attribute to the same. But here in the coastal areas, we generally see that the water table kinds of also gets disturbed, due to which the soil, the topsoil, is actually flooded with the groundwater, and it leads to the disintegration of the soil or the strength of the soil in those regions. So that is also leading to liquefaction of the soil, and the entire building can be seen, or various constructions or infrastructure in those coastal areas can actually be seen to be drowning between or below the soil due to this particular effect. We also have various instances where we have fires due to various earthquakes, due to the disruption of the power systems of the various infrastructure facilities. And finally, obviously at the end of the day, the livelihoods of the people are entirely disrupted. As we can understand, right now, India also has promised around more than 10 tons of humanitarian aid for Myanmar, because we already know that Myanmar was reeling under military crisis, under economic issues, after which an earthquake or natural disaster has impacted the place, due to which the livelihood of the people definitely will be affected. So this brings me to the challenges and also the various mitigation strategies we must be doing. Firstly, we understand that in India, some main important challenges in earthquake management pertain to the lapse in building regulations. Generally in heavily urbanized areas, we see that the buildings do not typically adhere to some building codes, due to which we need to have proper amount of building codes, proper amount of materials for construction, and each and everything as listed in as a part of the standard operating procedures. Also, due to unplanned urbanizations, due to construction of unplanned buildings, due to not following any proper plans, and also the proliferation of slums due to non-availability of public places, this lead to lots of destruction, mainly for the lower strata of our population. And that is where we need proper amount of land use planning in this particular aspect. Next, also we have seen in recent times the rise of tourism has led to the proliferation of so many tourist sites and the influx of tourists from the rest of the country, even from the rest of the world, due to which we try to build a new infrastructure, build new roads, mainly in the hilly areas where we already know that the Himalayan mountains are quite fragile. Alongside the same, we try to construct our own activities for tourism sectors, due to which we also have these kinds of earthquakes, which leads to lots of damages due to human related events. And for this, we obviously need a proper amount of disaster preparedness plan, correct? Next, also we understand that the high seismic activity is actually leading to a lot of Indian cities at the risk of earthquakes. In this figure, the larger the red dot, the greater is the frequency of potential earthquakes that can strike in these particular cities, as you can see here. So that is why we actually have to assess the risks of the various cities based on their individual, potential of having an earthquake. So that is why we need city level studies in this particular matter. Finally, at the end of the day, we need awareness and preparedness. Alongside the same, we have the National Disaster Management Authority, which time and again publish so many advertisements, try to make us aware of various provisions. And obviously, we also have lack of financial resources to cope up with the earthquake or disaster resilient infrastructure, due to which we have to integrate technology. We can actually learn from Japan's J-Alert system, which is using a sophisticated kind of technology to predict earthquakes before and try to minimize the losses, and also try to mobilize resources to mitigate the losses due to earthquake. Also, we can integrate right now the emerging technologies of AI and machine learning within the same. That is why we have to understand, over a period of time, the Indian government have actually ramped up its preparedness when it comes to the earthquake management in the country. Firstly, via the National Center for Seismology, which is actually under the Ministry of Earth Sciences and is having 115 observatories along the entire country, to actually try to measure the earthquakes which is taking place from the very minor earthquakes to major earthquakes. Also, we have the National Earthquake Risk Mitigation Project, which is classifying the various zones of our country based on the seismic activities, and generally this particular project is present in areas where we have the seismic zones 4 and 5, generally in the most risky areas. So where the main task is to coordinate with the state governments, with the district administration, and to bring in various amounts of preparedness and disaster resilience efforts. Next, we have the seismic micro-zonation of various cities, where generally cities where we have 5 lakh plus population, we have this particular overseeing of these cities and the various seismic activities by the National Center for Seismology. Also, we have the various advertisements such as this one on social media, print and digital media by the National Disaster Management Authority from time to time to educate the people and try to have a proper awareness campaign. Finally, at the end of the day, the government is also focusing right now on streamlining the building codes of the various materials, of the various raw materials that should be going into construction of buildings that are actually fit for that particular area in the seismic zone. That is where we have the Bureau of Indian Standards, we have the Building Materials and Technology Promotion Council, and the Housing and Urban Development Corporation, which is looking into overseeing this particular matter. So I tried to complete this earthquake topic in a very comprehensive way, and also you can understand the distribution of earthquakes over the entire earth and try to attempt this mains practice question, because unless and until we are trying to practice some questions, we are not going to come closer to perfection in the mains examination. Because when we talk about the mains examination in the past, in 2021 and 2015, they have asked us about the earthquakes in India, about the various vulnerability to earthquakes, and also how we have to give the examples of some major disasters in recent or say in the last 3 decades. This is how you have to keep in track of the various earthquakes which are taking place in recent times. So now we'll be moving on to the next one. So guys, in the next article, we are talking about India's geopolitical vision. This is actually an article which is written by a very eminent personality known as T.S. Tirumurti, who was actually a former ambassador of India. And he actually is writing on India's importance to focus not only on economic activities, on economic performance, but also to treat geopolitics as going in tandem with India's aspirations to become a Vishwaguru in the near future. That is why we'll be trying to simplify this editorial. And this particular editorial is important for our prelims, where we have current events of national and international importance. Also, we have the same in GS2, where we'll need to look into the effect of policies and politics of developing and developed countries on India's interest. That is why we have to talk about right now about how India's geopolitical vision needs to change right now. Why India, it is actually trying to boast that we are the 5th largest economy in the entire world. We are also trying to have so many infrastructural projects. We are also having comfortable and good performing FDIs in the country, and various other economic indicators such as India is one of those countries in the entire world between both developed and developing economies who is actually having a fastest amount of GDP growth in the entire world. So we have to appreciate India's economic growth. That is given, that is an established fact. But we have to understand, when it comes to geopolitics, when it comes to India influencing the geopolitics, India influencing some other countries, India taking part in some of the conflicts and trying to solve them, we do not see those avenues as of now. This is according to what the editorial author is trying to stress on, that on economic performance we are comfortably doing well. We are a developing economy. We are actually a young country where we have so many economic potentials. But alongside the same, a country cannot only rely on economics. We have to diversify in the geopolitical arena. That is why India must not exclusively focus on growth, because we have to understand that if India is to have global power, India needs to have proactive diplomacy with the rest of the world. India needs to be proactive. India needs to participate in various international affairs. Also, when it comes to the role of credibility of India in solving some of the crises that is taking place in recent times, we have to also understand that economics cannot help it. We have to also involve diplomacy in that. And finally, we have to understand that even when we are an aspiring economy, when we are a good performing economy, when the entire world is appreciating us for our economic performance, but that won't last long, because sustained economic performance will be needing a stronger clout or stronger influence on the global arena too. That is where we have to understand that India needs to participate in global affairs. And if we turn back the pages of our history, if we start from the Korean War and the Suez Canal crisis, India actually took stands on various important issues. India tried to talk about the various democratic ways in which we can solve the conflicts. India tried to do that in the past. Also in 1971, India tried to stop the genocide successfully in Bangladesh that led to their liberation in 1971. Also, India tried to take stands against the Myanmar Janta as a part of its Operation Cactus in 1988. Also, India tried to successfully ward off the various insurgency crises in Sri Lanka in 2009. You let me know in the comments what this issue was all about. Also, in recent times, India is trying to have good amount of collaboration with Pacific Island nations and mainly with our Indian Ocean region when it comes to anti-piracy operations. So we have to understand and appreciate India's efforts in all of this. But what about the Ukraine issue? What about the Gaza issue? What about the South China issue? When all of the countries are looking at India, they're looking at us as to what our opinions are, as to how India is standing on those issues. So that is why we have to understand that India's current approach is kind of seen as reticence in global conflicts or not. That is what we have to try to understand now. Firstly, we have to understand that India has tried to prioritize the economic sector, and also India fears that if I try to intervene in Russia or if I try to intervene in Israel and Palestine issue, maybe my economic interests will be hurt. Next, always India has put bilateral relations firstly, and India we can understand that over a period of time it has focused on improving relations with the rest of the world on an individual basis, but we have as a nation not been able to gather that global influence over a period of time. That is, we are still yet to have a kind of a global leadership, because generally we have this China and US which is kind of dictating all the rules of the games as of now. But over a period of time, if India wants to become a Vishwaguru, it has to actually rise beyond the bilateral relations to actually try to exert some of the influence. Also, India, according to the author, has this kind of what is known as the let others do it mentality. That is, for example, with reference to any conflicts or so on, it is actually opined by various critics and experts that India actually lets other countries do it. Right, and that is a very dangerous thing, because there are some other countries in the global south such as Brazil, Turkey, we have Saudi Arabia, which can actually fill the gap and fill the vacuum, as also that is being seen in the recent times. Next, and finally, India focuses a lot on strategic autonomy. India believes that obviously we have this kind of a strategic autonomy, that is our own independence to choose our own national interest and act according to our own ambitions. That is completely fine. But here we have to understand that if we are trying to have a lot of strategic autonomy, it can actually lead to the alienations of some important partners too. So that is why you have to keep in mind that these are some criticisms which some people have when it comes to this topic. Others also say, there are others people, it is also their opinion that it is more accurate to describe India's approach as pragmatic and as practical, because we have to act according to realities right now. We are in a condition where China is actually becoming powerful, and also we have a president in the United States which is actually trying to impose various tariffs. So in these conditions we have to balance our game here, right? So that is why we have to become extremely pragmatic, and definitely in the international arena we are independent. Whatever decisions we are going to take, whatever favors or whatever sides, whatever stands we are going to take, we are based on our own independent judgment. And also we obviously will be focusing on dialogue. Dialogues are most important things when it comes to the international relations, and definitely a dialogue between various issues, between various conflicts become extremely important, and obviously our national interests will be important. But we have to keep in these things in mind, according to the author also here, that the risks of staying passive are much more higher. That firstly, we have the rise of alternative mediators as of now. For example, say Turkey and Saudi Arabia, which can actually lead to pushing India out of the negotiation tables in many conflicts, right? Also, the US and the various parts of Europe are shifting to right-wing politics. This is also India must be highly aware of because of the various, say, nationalistic policy and protectionism policy that they are actually taking. Next, it is also to be understood that if India is not influencing its power, US and China, if at all in the near future, they achieve a detente or a deal between themselves, right? If US and China ever is trying to sign a deal between themselves, right? India can be sidelined in this manner. Right? So that is why India must not try to assume that, okay, we are kind of close to the US right now. In the future also we'll be closer. It is not the case, right? IR or say politics, geopolitics can always change and can lead India in muddy waters. Finally, we have to also talk about Quad because as of now, the current president of the US is actually focused on building his own country, on making his own country great again. And here, the various other institutions and various other organizations US are actually part of, they are not actually focused on revitalizing them. So based on this, Quad's relevance as of now is at stake, and that is why over a period of time, India may face greater Chinese pressure. And at the end, we have to learn from the past that recently India was actually left out of the Trioca Plus talks based on Afghanistan. That is also something which we have to keep in mind, that India must be trying to stress its importance. So that is what we have to focus on, what India must be doing. That is, we have to make a case for making India much more active in the global politics. Primarily, we must be trying to mediate in various conflicts that is taking place, right? We must be trying to leading in various forums so that we can actually lead the global South nations. Also, we can actually try to counterbalance India's influence in the Asian regions. And also in recent times, Putin's recent appreciation of our Prime Minister shows India's potential role as a peacemaker. That is also something which we must be forgetting. Secondly, we must be understanding that geopolitics is equal to economic strength. Correct? And we have to understand that also Donald Trump believes right now that if you do not have geopolitical influence, your economics is not enough. That is why even Donald Trump is also focusing on performing better in the geopolitical arena. This must be pushing India to perform even much better when it comes to moving beyond economics. Correct? And that is where, we also have to come to the matter that China is having dominance in trade. India must be trying to strengthening alliances beyond economics if it is trying to have its influence on the Chinese economic cloud too. That is why we have to focus on now that geopolitics is as important as economics, because geopolitics will be helping you better your economics over a period of time by having better ties, better deals with other countries. That is why we must be keeping this in mind. Finally, we have to keep in mind that multi-alignment is not enough, that India is trying to having multiple alignments with so many other countries. This is also not enough, because as of now, India believes that we have to have friendship with all, enemies with none. But yes, this is obviously the better way forward, because India as a country which is a follower of Mahatma Gandhi's principle, we have to keep friendship with all, and that is what is appreciated also in the very long run, which has also kept India's image integral. But also we have to keep in mind that in this particular aspect, India must not be skipping the various important agreements which are taking place. For example, India actually skipped the RCEP because of Chinese influence in the region. So that is what India should not be doing, this kind of aspects according to the author. India must be trying to participate in the various strategic aspects too, because this particular belief that obviously we need to have friendship with all, enemies with none, as that is why we have to keep in mind that we have to keep our competition closer. We have to keep our ties and the various relations intact with the various countries in this manner. That is why we must be having balancing economic relations with active diplomacy with some of the regions which are extremely important for India, such as Europe, Indo-Pacific, and most importantly right now in recent times, Africa, because it is told that in this particular century, Africa will be one of the most important continents to focus for India, because China is also focusing a lot of investments in that region. There are other strategic policy shifts which are needed. For example, we need to have proper amount of regional strategies too. We have to have proper amount of strategies between our neighbors, between our near neighbors, far neighbors such as the ASEAN nations. And also when we talk about an example, we have closer ties with Central Asia, and for which we have to participate even much more proactively in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which is actually aimed at this particular place. Next, also we have to keep in mind that Europe is under geopolitical pressure. Europe is a very in a very fragile condition right now. It is facing kind of an indirect alienation from the US. It is also facing competition and a huge amount of issues based on lawsuits coming from China. So that is why we have to keep in mind India can have this opportunity right now to become closer to the Europe. And also we have to move from Quad and beyond. We have to diversify our partners over a period of time. We have to focus on having many more bilateral trade agreements, if possible even FTAs with multiple nations, free trade agreements with multiple nations. And at the end of the day, we have to look into our own country by having proper internal reforms in our domestic place. That is why the main way forward here is to firstly appreciate the fact and understand and finally realize the fact that India can also be a swing power. By swing power, I generally mean that these are the countries, for example, if I talk about the Western nations, France, Germany, if I talk about the developing countries, we have Brazil, we have Saudi Arabia, we have Turkey, even we have India, who are actually not that prominent when it comes to superpowers such as US and China, but are as equal as decision makers, as participators in the global polity arena or in the geopolitical arena. This is where India must be appreciating its own role. We must be trying to understand that we have the power to influence so many world decisions. So we must be trying to go forward with that. Also, India must be clever enough to deploy so many mitigation strategies. This table is important for your examination. India must be being aware of so many mitigation strategies in cases of various scenarios. For example, we can have US sanctions on us for our closer ties with Russia. Correct? Now the main risk will be defense supply, and the various supplies that we get from US, those things will be disrupted. The best mitigation strategy is firstly we have to stockpile the spares, we have to diversify suppliers beyond the US. If, for example, there is another scenario where China and Russia is getting closer, so we can have a two-front threat where we have the threat at LAC and our borders. We can also have the threat in our Arctic areas, our Arctic region, where India is right now focused on, kind of having its economic interest in the region too. So based on this, we have to strengthen the Quad. We have to have better amount of EU partnerships which are also present in the region. So based on this, we can have multiple scenarios, and for each of the scenarios, we have to come up with various mitigation strategies. That is why the Ministry of External Affairs, along with the collaboration of a political class, we must be having or arriving at various mitigation strategies. Also, we must be having this kind of strategic autonomy with leverage. With the US, we have to leverage our or their tech and defense cooperation, but we have to avoid a Cold War 2.0 in the near future. Mainly, we see the rise of Donald Trump and so on, which can lead to such kind of future conflicts. Next, with Russia, we need to focus on energy and arms trade, but we have to reduce long-term dependency on Russia too. We have understood in the past also we are dependent on Russia. We are right now also kind of dependent based on energy and arms trade. We have to also diversify in the future. That is why we have to have some leverages. And finally, with China, we have these economic issues such as increasing amount of trade deficit. But at the end of the day, we have to also keep China closer. As of now, we have seen how recently both of the countries are trying to solve some of their disputes on the, say, public media. And finally, we have to also come to diplomatic tightrope. India must be walking on tightropes. India must not be visibly taking direct stands. It must always keep its national interest in mind. That is extremely important, right? And it should be sending the message that India cannot be pushed into a particular alliance or pushed into a particular group. And finally, we must be trying to balance economics with military preparedness too, because of the recent crisis, the recent conflicts which India is seeing right now, specifically which is happening all around us. So that is what brings me to this question. Please do try to write answers on a daily basis based on the questions that are provided in this section. Now we will be moving on to the simplified part. Now guys, this is an article based on the judges' assets, because we know that this Indian judiciary is in the news very often in the paper. We will not be trying to repeat whatever is the issue going on. We will be taking up a very important case when it pertains to the disclosure of the assets of a judge of the High Court and the Supreme Court in the country, which is extremely important for our Indian polity and governance, and also for the structure and functioning of our Indian judiciary. When I try to discuss about the norms regarding the disclosure of judges' assets in India, the most important question that comes to all our minds is whether the judges should be disclosing their assets or not. Because as of now, as we consider the various bureaucrats, the various politicians, the various other public servants, right? We know that the public servants are actually needed to disclose their information, their various kind of assets based on investments in real estate, stocks, and whatever, as a part of our either election disclosure, because as a candidate they have to talk about all of the assets that a politician has. Also, bureaucrats have the same provisions where they have to disclose the information if at all, if it is sought, or you have to actually disclose information according to requirements of various state governments. But when we talk about the Supreme Court judges and the High Court judges, that is not the same, because the Supreme Court is having a voluntary system, wherein in 1997 a resolution was adopted by the then Chief Justice of India, J.S. Verma, who actually tried to concur that the real estate investments and the various other assets should be disclosed to the Chief Justice, right? But he did not tell that there should be a public disclosure, that everyone like you and me can actually see the assets here. In 2009, right, a voluntary move was adopted where the High Court and the Supreme Court judges were encouraged to voluntarily disclose their kind of assets details on its website. But here we have to understand, as of now, only 28 out of 33 sitting judges of the Supreme Court right now, they have uploaded voluntarily their assets on the website. Also, as a part of 2019 RTI ruling, the Supreme Court told that judges' assets aren't personal information. So that is what we have to keep in mind. As of now also, we can understand that when we look at various high courts in the country, Delhi, Punjab, Haryana, Himachal Pradesh, Chhattisgarh, and so on, out of the total judges, we can understand only a minuscule amount of judges and their data are actually mentioned in the public domain. Correct? And also the entire data, we can understand only 97 judges out of 770 judges, that is 13% judges only, at 7 high courts, they have disclosed the assets here. And also most high courts in recent time, they reject RTIs. And also a recent case was the Uttarakhand High Court, right, who rejected RTI seeking information on the judges' assets. When we talk about the various practices which are conducted all around the world, the US is having the federal judges who must be filing public reports since 1978. The UK senior judges must be disclosing gifts and hospitality, not full assets rather. Next, the Brazilian judges must have full public disclosure for all judges here. And that is why we have to keep in mind that this kind of thing is actually kind of prominent around the entire world. But in India, that is not being followed on a mandatory basis. And here, when we look at the other details here, we have to keep in mind that public servants, unlike judges, are often mandated to declare their assets. But that is not the same case as we have seen in the cases of our Supreme Court and High Court judges. And also, the RTI Act becomes very important in this debate, because we know that the citizens of our country have this fundamental right to information. And that is what brings us to the question whether this assets of the judges at all should be brought under the RTI Act or not. In 2019, it was actually explicitly stated that the office of the Chief Justice of India is actually under the RTI Act. That was done. But what about the various personal assets of all the judges? What about those things which are actually must be available in the public domain? If the various government servants and everyone, they have to annually declare their assets, shouldn't the same case be with, say, the cases of the judges too? Based on this, Indian Express actually have had in the past filed RTA applications requesting the information regarding the various assets of various judges of the Allahabad High Court, but this was rejected. Correct? It was said that such information is outside the ambit of RTI Act. Also, the various other high courts, Rajasthan, Bombay, Gujarat, and so on, they also replied the same. And that is why, in the view of this situation, Parliament's various committees have actually recommended a legislation that must be introduced to actually disclose the assets and liabilities of the judges of the Supreme Court and the High Court. But as of now, the recommendations have not been made public as of now. So that is what we have to keep in mind. That are the details which are important in this article. Now moving on to the next one. Now in this one, there is a data that is telling that Indian courts have 1.45 lakh contempt cases pending. Again, a very important article for our Indian polity and governance, wherein we have to discuss about the GS2 syllabus also, where it pertains to the functioning of a judiciary. Now we know that for the proper functioning of judiciary, of Indian judiciary, we need to respect its authority, the various orders, judgment, directions, perspectives that the Supreme Court or the High Court or the subordinate courts in the country are giving. If we do not follow them, then what is the use of judiciary in the very first place? Imagine a person who has actually committed a crime. Now the Supreme Court has told that, okay, you are liable for this offense. So definitely the person has to obey that. In any matter, the person cannot say that the Supreme Court is composed of illiterate judges, the Supreme Court is doing that, Supreme Court is having this aspect, High Courts are involved in that aspect. Without any proof, without any evidence, any person cannot degrade the judiciary. That is also not only a provision which is important to preserve the integrity of the judiciary, but also that is needed to preserve the fundamental rights of the citizens. Because if the citizens do not respect the Supreme Court or the judiciary or the High Court or the lower courts for that matter, then what is the purpose of the law and justice in the country? That is why actions that disrespect or disobey a court's authority, undermining the dignity and the functionality of the courts, they actually will be facing contempt under the Contempt of Courts Act of 1971, which was actually under the recommendation of H. N. Sannal Committee. Where we have to keep in mind, we have several constitutional articles related to the same. Article 129, Article 142 subclause 2 and Article 215, which actually talk about the various provisions of maintaining various penal provisions for the contempt. Also, this contempt is classified into two ways, that is civil contempt, which is a case when a person is having a willful disobedience, for example against a judgment, decree, etc. Also, there can be criminal contempt when a person in publication, for example, using words spoken or written by signs or visual representations, or in any other case where this person is scandalizing the Supreme Court, it is lowering the authority of the courts here, of say not only Supreme Court, High Courts and other courts, or say having prejudice or interfering in the functioning of the courts here, or is interfering or obstructing the administration of justice, they all can face criminal contempt, and the punishment for the same will be, for example, a maximum imprisonment of up to 6 months, fines of around 2,000 rupees. But the best thing is here, if the person is kind of acknowledging their fault and apologizing the Supreme Court or High Court or the lower courts, they will be or either the fines or the imprisonments will be reduced, or they can be even totally be released. And also in this case, a very important fact for prelims, that when it comes to the contempt proceedings at the subordinate courts, it is the High Court which will be taking up the matter and deciding the punishment. Now, the main important thing here is actually how we process the information and solve the questions. So try to solve this 2022 PYQ in the comments, and we have to also keep some of the important data in mind, that there are around 1,800 contempt cases pending at the Supreme Court level and 1.43 lakh cases pending in the High Courts. That is why we have to understand there are so many cases which are pending, and this is actually a statement which is done by a parliamentarian in our legislature. That is why we have to understand that he is telling that the reasons for non-compliance with the orders in contempt cases is actually not available. We do not know why there are so many cases which are pending, but we have to understand that the responsibility of implementation of the court order rests with the respective administrative ministries. So this is a statement which this particular minister has made at the Parliament. the Lok Sabha has passed a very important bill, which is by the name of Carriage of Goods by Sea Bill 2024, where this act is trying to replace a 1925 act which is based on the same matter, where we have to understand when we try to compare the previous and the new acts right now, that is the previous legal language were extremely complex and having colonial era aspects here, and here in this new bill, in this new version of the act, it is much more easy to understand, and most importantly it is geared towards modernization of our ports by making it much more business friendly. And here we have to keep in mind that when it comes to the various ports and the various goods and services which are actually transported via the ships, here it is giving the center to amend the rules as needed, as opposed to the limited flexibility the central government had before. Also, the global compliance under the act is also maintained when it comes to the previous acts also, because the 1924 Hague rules is also applicable in the recent one, but here the implementation of these Hague rules which pertain to the carriage of goods and the various maintenance of those goods on say the maritime borders or say on the maritime territories, so this will be maintained properly by a better implementation under the new bill. And finally, the stakeholder clarity has been made much more clearer, because there have been so many legal disputes which were attributed out of the older act. For example, there can be many disputes between the various say stakeholders in the shipping sector based on the complexity of the legal language. But those things have been made much more clearer by actually giving various say clarity on the rights, duties and liabilities for shippers, carriers and so on, to reduce the amount of say conflicts in this matter. Now here there is a keyword which is mentioned in the article known as a bill of lading. Now bill of lading is actually a legal document by shipping company which is given to the cargo owner. If you want to ship a cargo, for example like this, right, if you are an exporter, so you will obviously give your cargo to the shipping company who will be shipping it to the country of your desire. So that is where this is a bill of lading, which is a legal document which is talking about the various types, quantity and the conditions of the goods, the origin and destination details of your goods, and the terms of transfer, such as if you have license, insurance for the various goods that you are going to ship. So mainly when I try to simplify this, the main key details here is that this bill is trying to aim and give clear responsibilities, liabilities, rights, immunities for various carriers in the shipping sector. This this particular act is applicable only when the ships are carrying goods from an Indian port to a foreign port, or from an Indian port to any other Indian port too. Thereby it is trying to cover the international carriers of goods from India and also within India. And here we have to understand that there are other benefits too. For example, the dispute resolution will be much more done in a regulated manner because of the ease of doing business provisions in this particular act. Next, also there will be lower compliance burden on the various stakeholders, that will be reducing their stress and burden. Also, the global trade confidence of India will be improving over a period of time. And finally, India will be having modernized logistics sector. Mainly what is the main thing that India is doing right now? It is trying to modernize the ports. It is trying to have various waterways in the country to have a proper amount of marine ecosystem. And finally, we have to look into the criticisms too. The main opposition actually tried to flag various concerns. Firstly, according to the opposition, we need to have better protection for shippers and consignees. This means that we need to have proper amount of legal safeguards in cases of any unfortunate events or any misfortune. Also, this bill does not, according to them, do not address adequately the risks related to discrepancies in weight declarations. So based on any say adulteration or any frauds that can take place, so those kind of things must also be incorporated inside this particular act here. The other criticisms, such as the implementation delay in the shipping sector, is something which the shipping sector is always concerned of. Be it any act, be it any policy, it takes a long time to implement it in the shipping sector. That is what also some criticisms by some sectors of the policy makers are, that again the implementation delays will be there in this particular act. That is why we must be trying to streamline the same. Then we can have carrier versus shipper conflicts. We can have exporter versus the shipping company conflicts. And these conflicts and the various ground for the same, we need to discuss in details in the act here. And finally, the bills of lading that we have discussed, right? They are also largely paper based as of now. We need to move on to blockchain technologies to actually try to not have, any kind of say interceptions or say duplicacies or errors or frauds in these particular bills, which are extremely important for this entire shipping sector. So this was all for this article here. Recently, the Union Cabinet has approved a 23,000 crore scheme for electronic components, and let me tell you, this is not your PLI scheme. This is actually different from the PLI scheme. That is what makes this extremely important. The entire name of the scheme is Electronics Component Manufacturing Scheme, where here the main incentive support and structure will be at the tune or say that based on the total turnover instead of some incremental sales as we have in the PLI, right? And here the main production and investment targets, as we can understand, is to firstly we have to create around 91,000 direct jobs. Next, we have a production target of 4.56 lakh crore and investment target of 59,000 crore almost, right? And this is focusing on bigger component. This is not focusing on the finished goods. This particular component manufacturing is looking at manufacturing circuit boards, lithium-ion batteries, hardware disclosures, sub-assemblies, display controllers, camera modules, and so on. So as we all know, these are the raw materials, where these are the raw materials that the country needs to manufacture TVs, to manufacture smartphones and various other electronic components, because we are kind of dependent on imports based on this. That is why India is trying to boost its capabilities. Also, the capital goods boost will be given because the government will be giving incentives for the heavy machinery that will be used to manufacture these components, because these particular machines, they are also expensive to procure. And the government will be focusing on existing hubs as of now, as in Coimbatore, Bengaluru, Pune, Rajkot and Vadodara. But firstly, we have to appreciate how this is different from the previous schemes. Earlier, the PLI scheme actually focused on the incremental, kind of say sales a particular company is doing, and mainly on the finished goods for a particular duration of time, and the amount of say investment targets and everything, they were fixed for every sector. For example, for white goods, for semiconductors, for various other aspects. But this new component scheme is taking three things into considerations: turnover, employment and capital expenditure. It is also focusing on components and sub-assemblies that are the raw materials, not the finished goods. And finally, it is having a duration of 6 years and a particular investment limit. Why the government came with this particular thing that is very different from the PLI in the very first place? Because we already had a PLI. We were actually supposed to have better manufacturing, right? But there are three key challenges according to the government. Firstly, the current lack of domestic scale is very visible. For example, if I am manufacturing an Apple iPhone, I am importing all the raw materials from China, Vietnam and so on. We do not have a scale in the country as of now. We don't have proper base in the country. That is why we need to have this. Also, we have a high investment to turnover ratio. For example, say if we are trying to focus on say manufacturing smartphone, right, every rupee of investment can bring in 20 rupees. However, in cases of electronic components, every rupee of investment is bringing only 2 to 4 rupees back when it talk about the returns of our investment. That is where we have high investment to turnover ratio. That is, high investment to turnover ratio is never good. That is, we need to have investments, right, over a period of time, and they must be giving us higher returns. Correct? That is why a lower investment to turnover ratio are always appreciated, as we have just discussed in the case of smartphones and the electronic components. Finally, India has a high domestic demand, due to which a large chunk of them are imported here. So that is why this particular initiative is very, very important. And here, that is actually the next step according to the government of India, apart from the PLI manufacturing scheme, where we have the domestic value addition extremely low. That is why the government is targeting to have the target of domestic value addition up to 30 to 40% from 15 to 20% as of now. And here, while this particular PLI scheme in the country they are doing well, they're performing well because of the imports of the finished goods, for example, say smartphones and everything. They have kind of come down over a period of time, but this components and everything we are trying to import from the rest of the world. That is where the high demand and supply gap to the tune of $100 billion for domestic consumption alone, and if we want to export these components also, we need $40 additional billion of these electronic components which must be manufactured in India. That is why the government is trying to right now give this kind of focus on the raw materials or say manufacturing of electronic components here, because we have to understand that in the country electronic components production stood only at $10 billion around, which is only 10% of the total electronics production. So that is where we need to focus on this particular initiatives too, which is apart from the PLI scheme. And in 2023, the question on PLI scheme was actually very important in the prelims examination, due to which you let me know what is the answer to the following. In the last article, I am going to discuss about the core sector of our country, which has slowed down to 5-month low of 2.7%. Firstly, we need to discuss the very basic thing as to start with what is the core sector in the very first place. We know that this core sector is actually based on an index that we get from the Office of Economic Advisor, published by the DPIIT under the Ministry of Commerce and Industries. This is known as the Index of 8 Core Industries. These are 8 key infrastructural industries such as petroleum, refinery products, we have electricity, we have steel, coal, crude oil, natural gas, cement, fertilizer. Note that there are percentages which are attached. These percentages tell that in this entire index, we have a weightage or importance of petroleum and refinery products at the highest level, followed by electricity, steel, coal, crude oil, and so on. Because in 2015, UPSC has actually asked us which of the following is given the highest weightage in the index of 8 core industry. So that is why we need to actually know about the ascending and descending order in the terms of their weightages too. Now, this is actually the index of 8 core industries published by the DPIIT. Now, we also have an index of industrial production which is released monthly by the NSO, right? Where the CSO is actually trying to compile the data, and all of the things are compiled according to mining, manufacturing and electricity. Also, if you can see, we have the relevant weightage here. The base year for both of these indexes are actually is 2011 to 12 financial years. So that is why we have to understand that index of 8 core industries is also factoring under the index of industrial production, where index of 8 core industries and all these 8 core sectors here, infrastructure sectors, they contribute to around 40.27% of the IIP. So we can actually relate that index of 8 core industries is actually a sub kind of an a data or measurement under the IIP itself. But it has to be noted, they're released separately by separate ministries altogether. And now, when I talk about the recent, index of 8 core industries, it has been slowing down in the recent times. And when we talk about the cement sector, it has recorded the highest increase among the 8 sector. And generally, we have to understand that the fertilizer growth is also highest since April 2023. But apart from this, all of the other aspects are slowing down. So this was all for today's discussion. I thank you all for being an extremely patient audience. Please do attempt the quiz which is following up. And till we meet again, all the best and best of luck. Thank you.